But what obviously is the worrying issue for the future is whether faith in the government to actually tackle these problems can be resolved. Because if it can't, then effectively a crisis that started with a collapse of faith in the shadow banking system and then moved to a collapse of faith in the banking system and a loss of faith in regulators will move logically to the next scenario, which is a collapse of faith in government or government's ability to deal with the problems. And the government has already fired off a lot of its ammunition. Now, you can sit there and argue about how do you deal with the potential collapse of faith in government or potential undermining of faith in government. And I should say it's particularly pertinent in a world where investors never used to worry about fat tail risks. They never used to worry about extreme scenarios. The last 2 years have been a very good training ground in worrying about fat tail risks, and they won't forget that in a hurry. But how do you deal with the potential collapse of faith in government? Well, the obvious thing, as Peter Peterson said, is to try to start producing some evidence of sustainable policies to produce a more sustainable fiscal future. That's going to be very hard, not least of which because it's going to be very hard to withdraw the government underpinning for the financial system that we have at the moment. In the late 1990s, I worked in Japan and looked at the Japanese financial crisis. And one of the things that stunned me was that Japan was always introducing these so-called emergency temporary measures to deal with the banks. And in the spring of 2007, I was chatting to some senior Japanese officials, and they told me that they were rather hoping they might finally get rid of the emergency temporary measures about 8 years after they were first introduced. Well, guess what? They didn't, because no sooner did they start putting in place the efforts to get rid of them that a new crisis hit. Once you've started having the government underpin the banking system, it gets very hard to pull it out. Unless, of course, you can find a way to rebuild faith in private sector banking again without the government support. That, of course, is what the Obama plan aims to do, and that's what it set out last week. And insofar as it sets off down that road, it's to be welcomed. I don't think it goes nearly far enough. It is, of course, addressing many of those pillars that I outlined before. It's rather ducked the bullet on the ratings issue, but it has at least raised the issue of transparency and hopefully started reform to the system in a way that means that investors won't rely on ratings quite so blindly in the future. On the banking side, there are efforts to make sure that the banks are better capitalized, therefore more trustworthy and more transparent. And of course, the new mantra in Washington is to create joined-up regulation, where regulators understand both the upside and downside of innovation and slicing and dicing, but also don't blindly follow any particular creed with terrible consequences. As I said, I don't think that necessarily goes far enough. Trust, once it's shattered, is very hard to rebuild in any sphere of life. And dealing with the current lack of trust can't be fixed merely by rules. It's going to require a change of attitude too. And above all else, it requires a situation where a congregation which has comprehensively lost faith in its financial priests and no longer believes in the value of financial Latin starts to regain that faith. Somehow, bankers need to relearn the basic lesson that they are there to be the servants of the economy, not the master. And somehow, bankers need to start making their blessings they convey on the rest of the economy transparent and creditworthy. If not, then the crisis of faith that we've seen start in the shadow banking world will inexorably spread from banking to regulators to governments too. So on that rather gloomy note, I wish you all the best of luck in rebuilding the credit of America in every sense, both in the sense of rebuilding the numbers, but also rebuilding credit in the fundamental idea that we need to trust, not just in bankers, but in each other again. Thank you.